News of the Times, the Kingsland Murders of 1890. Welcome to News of the Times. The Victorian East End of London was a brutal and unforgiving place where crime was a daily reality and gangs ruled with fear. In these rough enclaves, law-abiding citizens lived under the constant threat of violence. Even without the infamy of Jack the Ripper, newspaper reports from the era paint a grim picture of a district plagued by lawlessness, where murders were alarmingly frequent, sometimes occurring on a near weekly basis. One such shocking crime took place in August 1890 in Kingsland, a small settlement along Kingsland Road, now part of Dalston. It began in a local pub where a former soldier named Walter Hargan crossed paths with a gang of unruly thugs. After a confrontation, the gang pursued him into the street, and in a desperate bid to defend himself, Hargan shot and killed two of his attackers. The case, soon dubbed the Kingsland Murder or the Kingsland Tragedy, became a media sensation. For weeks, newspapers were filled with gripping reports of the trial at the Old Bailey. The story featured witness intimidation, false testimony, and ordinary people swept up in a whirlwind of violence and scandal. We take a look at the dramatic and tragic tale of the Kingsland Murder, a chilling glimpse into the darker side of Victorian London. And in today's end of episode further particular segment, we have an odd story from 1899 regarding the famous cemetery in Hyde Park, a buried cat, and hieroglyphics. We hope that you enjoy the show. Background. In 1890, the East End of London, home to Whitechapel, remained gripped by caution and fear, as the memory of the Ripper killings was still fresh in everyone's mind. The East End of London in 1890 was a gritty, overcrowded and impoverished area, marked by a mix of social struggle and crime. It was a place of contrast, home to both hard-working families on the lower social and financial spectrum and notorious criminals. The area was bleak. Smog and pollution from factories and coal fires darkened the skies. Streets were dirty and poorly lit. Gangs and petty crime were widespread. The area was infamous for prostitution and illegal drinking dens. It was therefore not so surprising and shocking that a double murder would take place there. But having a man waving a gun at a crowd of people and threatening to shoot them was utterly shocking. From the Morning Post, the 31st of July, 1890, double murder at Kingsland. A double murder was committed in Kingsland last evening under startling circumstances. The murderer is a discharged soldier named Hargan, and his victims are Walter Wheeler, aged about 35, Carman, residing at 85 Hertford Road, Kingsland, and William Lambert, aged about 60, Carman, residing at 25 Felton Street in Hoxton. The tragedy is said to be the outcome of a quarrel which took place in the Wagon and Horses Tavern in Hertford Road in Kingsland, but the evidence of the witnesses on this point being contradictory, it must be given with all reserves. A peculiar and extraordinary crime. There is no doubt, however, as to the circumstances of the crime, which appear to be of a peculiar and extraordinary nature. Wheeler and Lambert were standing in company with a man named Martin, residing at 24 Lenthal Road in Richmond Road, Kingsland, at the corner of Downham Road and Hertford Road, immediately in front of a baker's shop where Hargan passed up Downham Road towards Kingsland Road. Some remarks, it is stated, were passed regarding Hargan, who turned sharply round towards the trio at a distance of 3 or 4 yards, pointed a revolver at them and fired a shot in quick succession at each. Martin escaped uninjured, but Lambert and Wheeler fell. A large mob assembled. The neighbourhood being a populous one, a large and enraged mob speedily collected, but the murderer stood his ground, handling meanwhile the revolver, a 6-chambered Colt. What the sweep saw. The scene which occurred is described by a sweep named Newman, living opposite the scene of the murder. It states, "I was standing outside my shop about 4:45 and I saw a man pass. He was a smart, military-looking man and a stranger to me. A man named Martin said, 'That man has got a pistol.' I said, 'What's he want a pistol for?' Wheeler and Lambert, who I know well, were walking behind him, and someone shouted, 'Hi!' I don't think it was addressed to the murderer. He, however, turned round, being only about 4 yards away, and fired 3 shots in quick succession. Lambert fell first, and Wheeler fell immediately afterwards. The murderer walked away along the Downham Road towards Islington. I followed him at about a dozen yards, and he kept turning around and threatening to shoot me. He pointed the revolver at me about 14 times. A big crowd collected, and they wanted to lynch him. When we got to the corner of Southgate Road, we called on him to stop. He pointed the revolver at us again and threatened to shoot us. A man named Nifton raised his umbrella and diverted Hargan's attention when I took the opportunity to seize him from behind. Nifton and others seized him, and he struggled violently, so we knocked him down. The crowd made a rush for him and would have killed him when Knighton got up in front, and I took the revolver out of his right hand while I held his left. About 6 of us held him down and were going to tie him up when some man offered to take him to the station in his cart. We put him in the cart and sat on him. It was about 8 minutes before the police came, and during this time the crowd kicked him and threw all manner of things at him. The 2 bodies lay on the pavement for about 3/4 of an hour. Mr. William Knighton, an inspector of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, corroborated this story. At the police station. At the Dalston Lane police station, whither a howling mob had followed, Hargan gave his right name and put in his discharge from the Surrey regiment in which he had served until recently. He declined to explain the motive for the crime and was reticent regarding himself. He gave an address locally. He was about 30 years of age and of smart military appearance. He appeared to be perfectly sober. Dr. Livingston called. Dr. Livingston of Downham Road, who was called, pronounced both men dead, and their bodies were removed to the mortuary. The shot in one case had entered behind the ear, and in the other had penetrated the forehead. The shot fired at Martin lodged in the wall. Hargan will be brought up at the North London Police Court this morning. The crime hit the headlines for such a public murder of 2 with no known motive, followed by the scenes with the mob. Keeping in mind the location of the event, and it was in the very neighbourhood of the Whitechapel murders, only increased the reputation of the East End as one of the most dangerous places to be in England. The inquest into the deaths of the 2 victims was held on the afternoon of Saturday the 2nd of August, 1890. From the Western Times, the 4th of August 1890. The inquest verdict. At Kingsland on Saturday afternoon, Dr. MacDonald held an inquest on the bodies of William Lambert and Walter Wheeler, who died from the effects of pistol shots fired at them by a man named Walter Alfred Hargan, who is now under remand at the North London Police Court. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder against Hargan. Attention is drawn to the man responsible for the crimes. Investigations ensue to unravel the mystery behind the crime. From the Yorkshire Post, the 14th of August 1890, Hargan in court. At the North London Police Court yesterday, Walter Alfred Hargan, aged 27, was charged with the willful murder of William Lambert and Walter Wheeler by shooting them at Kingsland. Evidence was given that the deceased were at the Wagon and Horses public house and were annoying the landlady, and that the prisoner, who was in the private bar, came out and threatened the deceased with a revolver. The neighbourhood was a very rough one, and both the landlord and the landlady had been frequently threatened and assaulted. One witness stated that when the deceased threatened the landlady, the prisoner's face seemed to blanch with excitement, and, as he stood between the landlady and the men, he drew a revolver and flourished it as much as to say, "Beware." Subsequently, when the prisoner was walking down the road, he was followed by Lambert and Wheeler, and, turning round suddenly, he fired at them, and they fell. Prisoner further was remanded. Another court appearance takes place where Hargan is confined and confirmed to stand trial. The case continues to be splattered across the national papers. From the Manchester Courier, the 20th of August 1890, the Kingsland Murder. Walter Alfred was charged at the North London Police Court yesterday afternoon on remand with killing William Lambert and John Wheeler by shooting them in the street in Kingsland. The prisoner was at the Wagon and Horses, where the deceased was creating a disturbance, and the landlady having refused to serve, they followed the prisoner into the private bar and caught hold of him. When the prisoner left the house, the two men went after him. George Turner, fishmonger, said the deceased seemed to be drunk. While they were following the prisoner, Frederick Ramsey of Hertford Road saw the prisoner turn round and say to the deceased, "Do you follow me?" They were both about 12 yards distant when he drew a revolver and deliberately aimed at them. Both men fell. Witness knew Wheeler and Lambert as bad characters. Mrs. Peck, the landlady of the Wagon and Horses, stated that she had been threatened since the affair by the companions of the deceased. Police Constable Oakley said Wheeler was a very rough character. Mr. Young, for the defence, advised the prisoner to say nothing. He submitted that the case was one of justifiable homicide and that the prisoner had tried to get away from the deceased. He fired in the first instance to frighten them. Mr. Bross said that he should commit the prisoner for willful murder. As the case inches forward to trial, investigative reporters find what would appear to be an attempted intimidation of witnesses in the area. The Dundee Evening Telegraph is one of the few newspapers brave enough to report the threats being made against witnesses. From the Dundee Evening Telegraph, the 25th of August 1890, sequel to the Kingsland Murders. James Newman, chimney sweep of Hertford Road, Kingsland, was one of the witnesses in the double murder case at Kingsland, and he was summoned for an assault upon Mrs. Harriet Peck, wife of the landlord of the Wagon and Horses public house in Hertford Road, in whose house the deceased and Hargan, accused of their murder, were stood prior to the tragedy. Mr. Peck now said that on the afternoon of the 31st of July, the defendant and about 70 other rough fellows came into her husband's house and used very bad language, at the same time accusing her of having instigated the murders. They told her that she would also swing at the Old Bailey along with her fancy man. Walter Graves, the barman, seeming that the mob was angry, advised her to leave the bar. Just as she was going, Newman took up the large brass muller which was used for heating water and threw it at her. This struck her in the back, and immediately there followed 2-quart pots, thrown by she knew not whom, each of which hit her on the head, and one cut her left ear open. The result of all this was that she had been confined to her bed for 14 days. Dr. Charles Jackman gave evidence to the injuries and said the encephalitis had since set in. In reply to the magistrate, Mrs. Peck said she was positive that she saw the muller leave Newman's hands. The defendant denied the assault and called half a dozen witnesses, apparently of his own class, who swore that they were in the house at the time and saw neither the muller nor the pot thrown. Mr. Montague Williams said he believed that a most ruffianous assault had been committed, and he sent the defendant to prison for 1 month's hard labour. Although the sweep, a friend of Harman, is jailed for his attack upon one of the witnesses, the threats continued. From the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette, the 3rd of September 1890, Kingsland Ruffianism. Mr. C. V. Young made application to Mr. Marraham at the North London Police Court yesterday for 2 summonses for assault arising out of the Kingsland murder. Life in Hertford Road, where the murders were committed, said Mr. Young, has become intolerable, more especially to Mr. and Mrs. Peck, the landlord and landlady of the Waggon and Horses public house, and, on behalf of Mrs. Peck, he asked for 2 summonses. It appeared that, since what was known as the Kingsland tragedy, Mrs. Peck's life was rendered perfectly miserable. She was brutally assaulted 2 weeks ago, and one of her assailants was now undergoing a month's hard labour. But this, instead of acting as a warning, appeared rather to have inflamed people. Every time Mrs. Peck went out, she was molested. On Monday night, she was going out with a friend when Mrs. Newman, wife of the imprisoned chimney sweep, witness in the murder case, and a man named Gibson attacked her. She was one mass of bruises as a result of the assault. She escaped from Newman and Gibson and ran back into her house and had to be quickly dragged over the counter to avoid further violence. The people of this part of Hertford Road were very rough, and Mr. and Mrs. Peck felt they really must have protection or something more serious would happen. The magistrate granted the summonses, returnable and in the same time as others granted. The trial takes place with the help of the reports of the lawless East End, where women are unable to walk out on the streets without fear of being attacked. Hargan pleads not guilty on the grounds of self-defence. Put forward as well was Hargan's smart appearance in the lawless land of the East End and his military service record. From the Morning Post, the 13th of September 1890, the Kingsland tragedy. Walter Alfred Hargan, 27, described as a clerk, was indicted at the Central Criminal Court yesterday before Mr. Justice Charles for the wilful murder of William Lambert and also for the wilful murder of John Wheeler. Mr. Horace Avery and Mr. Muir prosecuted, and the prisoner was defended by Mr. Gregorin and Mr. Lever. The prisoner pleaded not guilty to both indictments. Mr. Avery, in opening the case to the jury, said that it was one which had excited some public attention and considerable local excitement, leading to witnesses to some extent taking sides in the matter, and also, he regretted to say, leading to the witnesses committing assaults upon one and another. One of them was undergoing a term of imprisonment for such an assault. The prisoner, from the evidence, appeared to have served some time in the army and to have gone with his regiment to India. In November 1889, he purchased his discharge, having risen to the rank of colour sergeant. In July, the prisoner returned from New York and went to reside in the Southgate Road, where he remained until the day of the murder. He was a customer at a public house called the Waggon and Horses, kept by a Mr. Thomas Peck, and the deceased men were also customers there. Lambert was a carman, living with his wife in Hoxton. Upon the day of the murder, Wheeler and Lambert and a man named Gray were in the Waggon and Horses. They were behaving in a disorderly manner, and ultimately they were ejected. During the disturbance, Mrs. Peck, the landlady, had been heard to say to the men, "I have somebody to protect me," and the prisoner appeared behind the bar and flourished a revolver, which he afterwards replaced in his pocket, making no remark. Afterwards, the three men followed the prisoner into the road, and at the corner of the Hertford Road, outside a baker's shop, the prisoner turned round and advanced a few paces toward the men. He produced a revolver and fired 3 times in succession. The first shot killed Lambert on the spot, and the second or third the man Wheeler. On the way to the police station, the prisoner was attacked by an infuriated mob and sustained serious injuries at their hands. Verdict. Mr. Justice Charles, in summing up, said the prima facie case was murder, but if the prisoner could satisfy the jury that he only acted in self-defence, then the crime might be reduced to manslaughter. The jury, after a quarter of an hour's deliberation, found the prisoner guilty of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 20 years penal servitude. Sentence reduced. The public outcry was severe as to what was deemed an overly harsh sentence. The Home Office, still reeling from all the aberrations from the lack of capture of the Ripper in the same area, commuted Hargan's sentence to 12 months hard labour. Once Hargan had completed his sentence, he walked free from the Sussex County Jail at Lewes on Monday the 7th of September 1890. Further particulars. Today's further particulars case comes to us from a famous Hyde Park cemetery where an infuriated woman buries her beloved cat whom she believes to have been poisoned. Unhappy with the injustice of this crime going unpunished, she places a curse upon the cat poisoner on the cat's tombstone. But that wording is deemed inappropriate for the sanctity of upscale Hyde Park Cemetery. So the bereaved woman comes up with an alternative. From the Boston Journal, the 25th of February, 1899. The grave of a cat. Hieroglyphics on your monument in Hyde Park. Did you ever visit, when you were in London, the Dogs Cemetery in Hyde Park? If you were ever there, you will be pained to know that the old custodian, Mr. Woolridge, died last month. And if you did not know the cemetery, listen to the story told by Mr. Woolridge to Mr. G.R. Sims. It is a tale of petty and malignant vengeance, and we repeat it in Mr. Sims's own words. Over the grave of a cat you will find a pathetic statement to the effect that poor pussy was cruelly poisoned and, in spite of all that veterinary science could do, died in a few hours in the arms of her broken-hearted mistress. Then, immediately beneath this statement, you will find an inscription in hieroglyphics of the Third Dynasty or something of that sort. This will astonish you. What on earth, you will say, has a cat's grave to do with hieroglyphics? Listen, and you shall hear. When the lady buried her beloved cat in Hyde Park Cemetery, her heart was filled with bitter hatred for its cowardly assassin. So she cursed that assassin in fine biblical language. The curse was carved on the tombstone. It cursed the murderer in his uprising and his down-sitting. It cursed him on earth, and it cursed him in hell. As old Woodridge said, it was a sort of curse that made you blind and took away your breath. Now, His Royal Highness the Duke of Cambridge was Ranger of Hyde Park, and his attention was caused and called to the curse, and George Ranger was shocked. So the officials communicated with the lady and ordered her to remove the cursing portion of Pussy's headstone. Eventually, the lady yielded, and the headstone was to be altered. When it was brought back and set up again, the space which the curse had hitherto occupied was filled with ancient hieroglyphics. But the lady had not abandoned her curse. It was that hardly anybody could read it. She had taken the headstone to the British Museum, engaged the services of a learned professor, and the professor had translated the curse into ancient Egyptian. And so, Pussy's murderer is still cursed upon Pussy's tombstone in the Hyde Park Cemetery. That concludes this episode of the Kingsland Murders of 1890. We really hope you enjoyed the show. If you did enjoy this show, we would be grateful if you could like, comment and or share the video to friends, family or even the family pet. It all helps to keep us relevant in the giant ocean that is YouTube. Thank you for the support, and it's gratefully appreciated. You've been listening to News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles.